Folks, there's a bloody lot of things about FromSoft's modern games that I really like. The enemies, the bosses, the levels, the atmosphere, the lore, the soundtracks, the cats, etc, etc. But unless you're some sort of minimalistic, masochistic, pugilistic punk prowling the lost lands of the lands between and such, trying to punch and clobber every crawfish, demon, beast and knight with your bare bloody fists, you're going to want a weapon. And a wonderful aspect of these games that they have a whole lot of weapons to choose from, found in all sorts of places, sometimes out in the open, sometimes tucked away in a chest, and sometimes as a drop from enemies. But this video isn't going to be about any old weapon, no. This video's about boss weapons, quite arguably the sickest subset of weapons of all. For those unaware, boss weapons are those which are created through the use of boss souls with the help of particular NPCs, and this feature has been around ever since Demon Souls, also appearing in some Souls-likes, and still featuring very strongly in Elden Ring, all to make it feel that much sweeter and more rewarding when you've finally managed to nail a real bastard of a boss, and now you get to use their own weapon, or a weapon made to resemble that boss's very essence. As for the main thrust of this video, I'm going to be picking what I consider to be the sickest boss weapon from each of these 6 games, with an honourable mention for each game too. What do I mean by sickest? Well, coolest, most badass, the most interesting with the greatest amount of character. This weapon is not strictly about the strongest weapon from each game or the most effective for PvP, because that's getting too much into the territory of stats and numbers and objective answers, which is not something I'm interested in. This is about weapons which, for one reason or another, I consider particularly flavourful, particularly sick. If you like the video, hey, why not subscribe to the channel? I make fun videos about great games, and please allow me to give a massive thanks to my brilliant patrons for supporting the channel. And with all that being said, let's kick off the list with a bit of Demon's Souls. So here's the thing about making boss weapons in Demon's Souls, and Dark Souls 1 for that matter. To put it in technical terms, it kinda sucks. For a start, until you defeat the Flame Lurker, you ain't transposing a goddamn thing, bucko. And the Flame Lurker is not an easy boss. In fact, you can even argue that it's the hardest in the game, but nailing it gets you the Searing Demon Soul, or the Red Hot Demon Soul as it was called in the original. Still don't know why they changed that name, to be honest. It's way too easy to just pop the Searing Demon Soul for an easy 18,000 bucks, especially if you don't know there's more to this thing than meets the eye. But if you exhaust Blacksmith Ed's dialogue and then speak to him again whilst holding the soul, he will take it from you, and thus, finally, you can use those boss souls you've been hoarding to make some sick new weapons. So long as you also bring along a weapon of the same or similar type to the one you want to transpose, and as long as that weapon is already sufficiently upgraded. The whole thing's a real hullabaloo. Despite the hoops you must jump through beforehand though, some of these weapons are pretty damn special, with great movesets, fancy effects and sky-high damage potential. But my pick for sickest Demon's Souls weapon goes to the Morion Blade. There are a few weapons in this game which are directly used by specific demons, like how the Adjudicator uses the Meat Cleaver, and how the Old Hero uses the large Sword of Searching, and you can even see a Scraping Spear being flung from the Phalanx boss arena, even if the Phalanx enemies themselves don't actually use Scraping Spears. But the Morion Blade is not used by any other entity in the game. Rather, the soul it is transposed from is that of the Storm King, the gargantuan beast which serves as the Shrine of Storm's archdemon. Might seem like an odd weapon to come about from such an alien-looking entity, and its minions attack you with magic crystalline projectiles rather than any sort of conventional weaponry, but the Morion Blade is literally made from the thorny black quartz marrow of these storm beasts, giving it a very otherworldly appearance, as well as special qualities in battle. If your HP falls below 30% with this weapon equipped, you get a massive 60% damage boost, essentially an even more powerful buff than the one given to you by the clever rat ring, though the effects from the two pieces of equipment even stack on top of one another to provide an absurd damage buff, providing you're brave enough to walk around everywhere at low HP, which I personally am not. Even sans buff though, the Morion Blade is a banger of a weapon. It has low stat requirements and superb damage output regardless of your stats, because like a few Demon Souls boss weapons, it does not feature any stat scaling whatsoever, which can be both a good or a bad thing. Funnily enough though, a lot of folk don't directly use the Morion Blade at all, because as long as you have it equipped in some way, you will be able to make use of that critical health damage buff, but I'd much rather see this weapon than have it tucked away in my rear, because goddamn does it look good. It has a very wicked gothic design to it. In fact, its design reminds me of an old gothic style church that I visited in Edinburgh, just very dark and pointed. FromSoft even brought the Morion Blade back for Dark Souls 3, where it also features a damage buff when at critical HP, which also stacks with the effects of the red Tearstone ring, which is essentially the Dark Souls version of the clever rat ring, except not as good. Other than that though, Dark Souls 3's Morion Blade has a very different design to its Demon Souls counterpart, the latter of which I much prefer. As far as practicality goes, I'm actually a staunch proponent of the old hero's large sword of searching, which is crazy strong, has a way faster moveset than it has any right to have, boasts great range, and also grants you a massive item discovery boost. But aesthetically, I'm a Morion man, and by the way, did you know that Morion is a real word? It refers to a type of helmet worn by 16th and 17th century Spanish soldiers. My honourable mention goes to the Dozer Axe. This weapon can be transposed with the Grey Demon Soul dropped by the Vanguard from the tutorial, or the one from the Shrine of Storms, or even both of them if you really want. The Grey Demon Soul is the only boss soul that you can legitimately get 2 of per playthrough. Some boss souls can be traded into Saint Urbane or Sage Frake for powerful miracles or spells, like the aforementioned Storm Demon Soul, which can get you the anti-magic field miracle if you're not too interested in the Morion Blade. But the Grey Demon Soul can only be used to get yourself an axe, a very special axe, the Dozer Axe. Design wise, it's kind of a weird one, because while the Vanguard Demon does itself wield a particularly large and brutal axe both times you encounter it, that ain't no Dozer Axe it's using, meaning that just like the Morion Blade, this is a completely unique weapon you're making from a Demon Soul, and a damn intimidating one too. The Dozer Axe's only stat requirement is a fairly high 30 in strength, though sadly it features absolutely zero stat scaling. I was kinda disappointed when I saw this the first time I made one, because I imagined it would make for the perfect strength weapon, but not quite I guess. Scaling or no though, this big hunk of metal hits extremely hard and has an excellent capacity for stunning, staggering and generally knocking down enemies, kind of trivialising a lot of combat encounters with foes who are vulnerable to getting flattened by its immense weight. But do you know the thing I really love about the Dozer Axe? The fact that it's barely even an axe. In fact, despite its name, it does not feature a true bladed edge. It's more akin to a particularly wicked hammer than an axe, made for crushing rather than cutting. Some weapons appeal to me because of the elegance and intricacy of their design, while others impress me due to the sheer excessiveness of their design, the rawness, and the Dozer Axe is certainly one such weapon. Dark Souls 1 is the same sort of dealio as Demon Souls when it comes to making boss weapons, though the first bunch of bosses you fight don't actually drop special souls at all, which I've always found kinda lame. You get no boss soul rewards from the Asylum Demon, Taurus Demon, Bell Gargoyles, Pinwheel, Capra Demon or the Gaping Dragon. Most folks' first boss soul will be from Chaos Witch Quelag, though you can get one earlier if you choose to take on the Moonlight Butterfly, or if you challenge Sif earlier on. But even once you do start getting them as rewards, well, you can pop them for a soul reward or just feed them to this mustached fuck. Best keep a hold of them until you make it to Anor Londo, to the giant blacksmith who will transpose your regular weapons into boss weapons, again provided you have the prerequisite boss soul and a sufficiently upgraded weapon of the correct type. Unlike Demon Souls though, some boss souls actually give you a choice of different weapons to make, like how the Moonlight Butterfly soul can be made into the Crystal Ring Shield or the Moonlight Butterfly Horn, or the soul of Quelag can be made into Quelag's Fury Sword or the Chaos Blade. As cool as this is, it also makes it a bit of a ball ache if you want to achieve the Knight's Honour trophy, which requires you to get every possible boss weapon, because it means you need to play through the game multiple times to get it, at least 2.5 times actually, thanks to the bloody Soul of Sif, which can be transposed into either the Great Shield of Artorias, the Great Sword of Artorias, or the cursed version of the Great Sword of Artorias. Which brings us on to my pick for Sickest Dark Souls boss weapon, the Abyss Greatsword. An extremely cool aspect of the Abyss Greatsword is that it is essentially the third and final form of the Great Sword of Artorias. The original untainted version of it can be made with the soul of Sif and the Great Sword, Straight Sword or Dagger, and then the cursed version can also be made with the soul of Sif and the Straight Sword hilt or broken Straight Sword, appearing darker and more opaque in appearance, just as Artorias' soul began to lose its purity. And then finally, the Abyss Greatsword can only be made with the soul of Artorias himself, who, by the time we meet him, has become fully corrupted by the Abyss, to the point of animalistic frenzy, with his soul now being drenched with the purple taint of the dark, reflected in his weapon, which appears far more stained and corrupted than either version of the Greatsword of Artorias. And this weapon would even reappear as the majestic Greatsword in Dark Souls 2, and again as the Wolf Knight's Greatsword in Dark Souls 3. The most obnoxious aspect of the Abyss Greatsword is definitely its stat requirements. The 22 strength and 18 dex requirement ain't too bad, but I do not love the fact that you also need 18 points in intelligence and faith, especially because it doesn't actually scale with either of these stats or even deal any bonus elemental damage, though it does scale with your humanity counter, similarly to chaos infused weapons. This weapon's stat requirements actually caused me some grief, because even though I have a New Game Plus 3 save file where I've obtained every boss weapon, I had to start a fresh playthrough to be able to show off the Abyss Greatsword's moves for this video, because I just didn't have anywhere close to its stat requirements. Could have grinded, but I needed way more levels than I had, and I was already at the point where each level up was costing about 130,000 souls, so it was just easier to start a new game and level up more intelligently, rather than spending about 4 fucking hours grinding for souls at that bit in the painted world of Ariamis, you know the bit. All just so I can actually try out the sword's fancy flips and spins for myself, the same sorts of moves that Artorias uses when you're fighting him, and which cannot be pulled off with any other greatsword. Felt very cool using this thing against Great Grey Wolf Sif, and a little bit sad really. Especially when the dumb mutt ended up killing me. That'll teach me to get all fancy and turn my HUD off. Bad dog! Foolish deaths aside though, the Abyss Greatsword is an awesome weapon, and I love the way Artorias' various greatswords symbolise his own gradual corruption by the dark. Yes, there are more outlandish and demonic weapons I could have went for, like Quellag's Fury Sword, but for as jagged and fiery as that blade is, it lacks the dark depths of the Abyss Greatsword. My honourable mention goes to Smo's Hammer. We all know what an epic and challenging boss fight Ornstein and Smo are, even if their difficulty nowadays feels somewhat diminished in comparison to the kinds of bosses that Bloodborne, Sekiro and Elden Ring threw at us. A lot of folk really struggled against these two fellas back in the day. Ornstein with his jagged, leonine armour and lightning-imbued Dragon Slayer spear, and Executioner Smo with his terrifying armour and big, brutal hammer. Smo's Hammer is the single heaviest weapon in Dark Souls 1, has the single highest strength requirement at a whopping 58, which is 18 points higher than Havel's Dragon Tooth, and it's pretty much the biggest weapon in the game too, to the extent that it kinda obscures your view a bit when running round, but look, who cares, who needs vision when you're armed with this golden behemoth of a hammer? Part of the appeal for me insofar as its design is concerned is that for as brutal as it looks, there's also kind of a foolish aspect too. I mean, let's be honest here.
Let's be honest. Okay. Let us be fucking honest.
Smo's Hammer looks like a bongo drum, but that's what I like about it. There's nothing fancy about it, it's just a huge, ultra heavy hammer made for Smo to mercilessly execute the condemned, and then to further pound their bones and bodies into dust to be mixed in with his food. Sadly, the strength scaling on this thing ain't as impressive as you might think, considering it looks like the ultimate bloody strength weapon, but even so, it was doing crazy damage even without me having upgraded it. And it even heals you up a little bit with each hit, playing into the whole Smo being a cannibal thing, being nourished by inflicting damage and death onto his enemies. You can even use Smo's classic jumping hammer slam with this thing, and it's really sick. I had tremendous fun donning the full Smo ensemble and running it around a bit, but all his gear is insanely heavy and so it was not exactly practical, even with Havel's ring equipped. Regardless, badass looking weapon that is excessive in every respect, and it was even brought back for Dark Souls 3. Aha! Now Dark Souls 2 is when FromSoft finally began to take mercy on us with the whole boss weapon transposition thing, because for the first time you no longer needed to also find and upgrade a corresponding type of weapon. Now you just need the boss soul and some souls as payment. Furthermore, whereas I believe less than half of Dark Souls 1's bosses actually dropped boss souls, nearly every boss drops its soul in Dark Souls 2, and this game has a lot of bosses, and you can often transpose a boss soul into one of several different weapons. For example, the Dragon Rider soul can be used to create the Dragon Rider halberd, shield, bow, or even the twin blade, which no in-game Dragon Rider enemy even uses. Say what you want about Dark Souls 2, but it went hard with its weapons. There are so many to choose from and it's sick. In fact, if we're including shields and bows and such too, this game has 55 different boss weapons, and that's not even including all the sorceries, pyromancies, hexes and miracles you can transpose from boss souls. As for my personal favourite though, well, for as large and varied as the selection absolutely is, it was always going to be the Crypt Black Sword. This is a weapon that you can't actually get on your first playthrough too. I consider it to be an objective fact that Dark Souls 2 handled New Game Plus way better than any other FromSoft game, adding in new phantoms, events, and most importantly, additional boss souls. On New Game Plus, beating the Jukesteer Freya nets you the old Pale Drake soul, beating the Lost Sinner gets you the old Witch soul, beating the old Iron King gets you the old King soul, and nailing the Rotten gets you the old Dead One soul. The old Dead One referenced here is of course Gravelord Nito, though rather than this soul getting you something like the Gravelord Greatsword, it can be traded into Weaponsmith Ornifex for the Crypt Black Sword. God damn, that is a cool name for a sword. The Crypt Black Sword is an ultra greatsword, being far larger and heavier than a regular greatsword, and there's really nothing conventional or plain about this wicked weapon. Just as Artorias' Abyss Greatsword also came with a couple of pain-in-the-arse extra stat requirements, so does the Crypt Black Sword, also needing 12 points in Intelligence and in Faith. Of course, this stat requirement is nowhere near as annoying as it was with the Abyss Greatsword because 1. 12 is less than 18, everyone knows that. 2. The Crypt Black Sword also does inherent dark damage as well as physical damage, and it can be infused with any other additional element over at Blacksmith McDuff. And 3, unlike in Demon Souls or Dark Souls 1, finally, Dark Souls 2 actually lets you respec, so long as you've got a soul vessel. As far as movesets go, the Crypt Black Sword doesn't have anything all that fancy, but it doesn't need anything fancy because it deals a hell of a lot of damage and is great at knocking enemies down. It's just a very excessive weapon, much like Smo's hammer. I used to think it wasn't used by any other entity in the game, but no, turns out Grave Warden Agdane down in the Undead Crypt wields it when you summon him for the fight with Velstadt, or against you if you manage to sufficiently piss him off. Though of course he doesn't drop the weapon upon defeat. Look though, come on, guys, ladies, we know why we love the Crypt Black Sword. It's because it's a heavy homage to Guts' Dragon Slayer sword from Berserk. The designs aren't completely identical, but they are extremely similar, and it's no secret that many elements from FromSoft's games are heavily inspired by Berserk. The Crypt Black Sword, however, has to be my personal favourite inspiration, or homage, or tribute, or whatever you want to call it. I don't always use greatswords when playing these games, but when I do, I like them to be chunky, heavy, thick, creamy, delicious. I want to put them in my mouth, I want to taste them. I want to caress them with my... Sorry, what were we talking about? My honourable mention actually bears some striking similarities to the Crypt Black Sword. It's the Sacred Chime Hammer. In fact, the stat requirements of each weapon are almost identical, except that the hammer needs 12 points in dexterity instead of the 10 needed by the Black Sword. Like the Black Sword though, the Sacred Chime Hammer also scales very well with dark and deals dark damage, and it's also used by a certain royal knight found in the Undead Crypt, that being Velstadt, the Royal Aegis. You know me, I love a weapon that tells a story, one that represents the character of its original owner, which is exactly the case with this weapon. When you encounter Velstadt, he's kneeling in the one remaining beam of light found in the Undead Crypt, as if in prayer, with his role here being to ward off any trespassers seeking to do harm to what remains of King Vendrick, who is, by this point, a shambling hollow, devoid of his former intelligence and kingly grace. Although Velstadt initially seems pretty much untouched by the corruption found everywhere else in the level, at the halfway point of the fight, he rings his Sacred Chime Hammer, calling upon the powers of the dark, showing that this formerly holy and blessed weapon is itself now tainted, used to channel the darkness which has, over time, been thoroughly infused into Velstadt's very soul. I love Velstadt as a boss. I actually think he's one of the best in the game, but his weapon is a massive part of that, this enormous brass bell used as a hammer. I believe the Sacred Chime Hammer is considered to be one of the best weapons in the game, and no wonder when you look at its excellent scaling, massive base damage and additional dark damage, and unlike the Crypt Black Sword, it even features a special attack where it can unleash several projectiles, giving the weapon a nice wee bit of ranged utility too. Dressing up as Artorias or Smo is for sure a lot of fun, but honestly, for me, nothing beats sprinting around town wielding the Sacred Chime Hammer with Velstadt's set on. Now this is Fashion Souls. Just like with the previous game in the series, there's not all that much fannying around required to transpose boss weapons in Dark Souls 3. You do first need to acquire the transposing kiln from the curse-rotted Greatwood boss over in the Undead Settlement, but that's not too far into the game, and after giving it to Ludleth of Corland, you're free to make all sorts of exotic armaments and sorceries and miracles and whatever else, provided you have the corresponding boss soul. But we're specifically talking about weapons here, and as is always the case with these games, there's some nice ones, some nasty ones, and some big ones, but my pick for absolute bloody sickest goes to Gale's Greatsword. Yet again, this really is another case where the backstory and downfall of the weapon's owner plays very heavily into why I made my choice, and I must also disclaim that I consider Slave Knight Gale to be FromSoft's greatest ever boss. He's pretty much perfect in my eyes, and as a character, very tragic. He is of course the end boss of the Ringed City DLC, but you encounter him as early as the Cleansing Chapel by the Cathedral of the Deep, where he tempts you into entering his lady's painting, with the lady in question being this young girl residing in the attic of the Ariandel Chapel, cheerfully talking about silly Uncle Gale, whose set you can find in the Corvian settlement area of this DLC. Gale can aid you in the fight against Sister Freed, and again in the fight with the demons at the bottom of the Dreg Heap, but the next time you see him is in this apocalyptic wasteland of dust and ash, and here he is significantly more monstrous, mutated and maddened, thanks to his relentless consumption of the blood of the Dark Soul, to be used as a pigment to aid in the completion of his lady's painting. His sword though, my god. It is a ruined, rusted mess. When you summon Gale for bosses, it's not this weapon he uses, but rather an Executioner's Greatsword, but by the time we encounter him in the wasteland of the Ringed City, it is flat out broken and stained with the blood of countless battles, of victims of the Red Hood. It really adds to both the badassery and tragedy of Gale's character that he continued to use this weapon long after it should have been replaced or repaired, so single-minded was he in his mission to gather the blood of the Dark Soul. Gale's Greatsword has the exact same stat requirements as the Executioner's Greatsword, but boasts slightly better base damage, as well as slightly better scaling with dexterity. Despite the pointy bit of the sword being a bit of a fucking mess by this point, it still does feature very useful thrust attacks from its R2 move, instead of the downward slam of many of the game's other greatswords, and the Executioner's Greatsword. Though the most enjoyable part about Gale's Greatsword for me is its damn weapon art, letting you pull off the same manoeuvres as Gale does during his first phase where he's rampaging around the Ashen Wastes on all fours like a beast. His motions aren't all that dissimilar to Artorias' actually. Incredible boss, fantastic character, sick goddamn weapon. For my honourable mention, I am going with the Dragon Slayer Great Axe. When I first entered through that big fog wall in Lothric Castle and saw the huge pilgrim butterfly rising up into the sky, I thought, oh god, oh good god, am I going to have to fight that thing, what even is it? But then as the winged monstrosity ascended higher into the air and out of sight, I saw the true boss, and that boss was the Dragon Slayer armour. And the first thing I thought when I saw this thing was Dragon Slayer Ornstein. But Ornstein's choice of armour was somewhat different to this, far more refined and detailed, both when you fight him in Dark Souls 1 and when you fight whoever is wearing his armour in Dark Souls 2. And in both of those cases, the boss's choice of weapon is the Dragon Slayer Spear, a weapon imbued with lightning and designed to be driven deep into the tough hides of dragons, who were the sworn enemies of Anor Londo. The Dragon Slayer armour, however, this possessed mass of warped iron, does not use a spear, but an axe. A great axe. The greatest of all axes. The Dragon Slayer Great Axe. Now, I do have to say that one aspect of the Dragon Slayer Great Axe did make me think about rethinking my decision to choose it as my honourable mention, and that is the fact that it looks way more impressive when the boss is using it compared to when we as players use it. I guess you can say much the same about most boss weapons, because it's a visual design theme in FromSoft's games to have weapons and armour and such simply scale up and down depending on which entity is wielding or wearing them. Doesn't really make the slightest bit of sense if I'm being honest, but who cares, these are games and it's cool. And as such, the Dragon Slayer Great Axe looks particularly colossal and intimidating when the boss itself is wielding it, especially the way it's constantly sparking with electricity throughout the fight. Even so, it's still a goddamn killer looking weapon when we get to use it, even if it is a bit smaller and without the lightning effect. It kinda looks like the Dozer axe from Demon's Souls, except it does have a bit more of an actual edge, and the handle is longer, and it actually scales well with your stats, and it even does lightning damage, oh you bet it does. Not that it even needs to be honest, because even without the lightning and that faith scaling, it does crazy physical damage too. As you'd expect, this isn't exactly the swiftest weapon in the game, meaning you need to time your attacks well when fighting your more nimble bosses, but you really can flatten stuff with this thing, especially with its weapon art. Again, this move is slow as hell, but the damage is well worth the wait, often one-shotting regular enemies and staggering bosses. I tried fighting Slave Knight Gale with this weapon and I was pretty reliably able to stagger him after every 2 hits, at least in phase 1. Now that's my kind of weapon, hehehe. I'm a Bloodborne boy, it's no secret. And as far as sick weapons go, well, folks, is there any more sick weapon than a trick weapon? No, is the answer to that question. Must point out though that Bloodborne is the outlier of this list, in that it does not feature a boss soul mechanic. And furthermore, most of what you fight are beasts and eldritch horrors who do not use weapons, instead preferring to fight with claws, teeth and tentacles. There are badges which allow you to purchase new items and equipment, like the Old Hunter's badge dropped by Gehrman, but in lots of cases you can just find specific weapons out in the world, rather than having to buy them in this way, especially in the DLC. There really weren't many boss weapons to actually choose from here. In fact, there's like 3. Or 4 if you include the Hunter's Axe, used by Father Gascoigne, but seeing as how you can literally start with that weapon, not quite sure it counts. Despite the lack of choice though, what is here happens to be stellar, which brings me to my choice for number 1 sickest Bloodborne boss weapon, the Holy Moonlight Sword. The boss who uses the Holy Moonlight Sword is of course Ludwig, the Holy Blade, who transforms from a frenzied beast in phase 1 into a far more intelligent and even refined being for phase 2, channeling his past human self from when he was the first hunter of the Healing Church. Of course, long before this boss encounter you can get your hands on Ludwig's Holy Blade and his Holy Rifle, which are 2 very powerful weapons themselves, but which aren't imbued with any sort of arcane power. Bloodborne did of course come out after Demon's Souls, Dark Souls 1 and Dark Souls 2, which all feature iterations of the Moonlight Greatsword. And I remember folk initially theorising that Ludwig's Holy Blade itself was Bloodborne's answer to the Moonlight Greatsword, but then the DLC came out and we encountered Ludwig, whereupon the true Holy Moonlight Sword was revealed in one of the all-time greatest video game cutscenes. Indeed, just like with the Dragon Slayer Great Axe, this weapon is fucking massive when the boss itself wields it. I mean, from hilt to tip, the thing must be about 5 times the height of your character. But, as the old saying goes, it's not the size of the sword that matters, but rather its ability to channel the abyssal cosmos into damaging waves of arcane light. You can get the Holy Moonlight Sword simply by finishing off Ludwig's disembodied head after the battle, and indeed, it actually has very similar stat requirements and scaling to Ludwig's Holy Blade, except with an additional requirement of 14 points into Arcane, and with far better Arcane scaling, which of course directly contributes to the damage of its alternate form. Even though Bloodborne's main shtick as far as its weapon goes, the whole trick thing featuring tricky transformations from one weapon into another, some weapons only really get a buff, like the Tonitrus or the Boomhammer, and indeed, the Holy Moonlight Blade is one of those weapons, except the buff is that bit more special, transforming it from an already impressive looking greatsword into that classic Moonlight greatsword shape and colour that we all know and love, dealing extra arcane damage upon attack, and also sending forth damaging light waves from some attacks at the cost of a quicksilver bullet each time. To be honest, I've always found myself a wee bit disappointed with the extra arcane damage this thing deals, but these extra moves are flashy as hell in a way I really like, and the AoE L2 move in particular is extremely useful for bosses and enemies alike, knocking them down as well as doing great damage. The Moonlight Greatsword is a classic Soulsborne weapon, even appearing in a few of FromSoft's pre-Souls games, but my all-time favourite version of it is right here in Bloodborne. My honourable mention goes to the Rikuyu, the very weapon used by Lady Maria of the Astral Clock Tower. As a boss, Maria is hard as balls. Not quite as hard as Sister Fried from Dark Souls 3, who I consider to be the hardest in that game, but she's tough alright, though the fact that she is highly staggerable does do a lot to make her more manageable for scrubs like me. As for her weapon, the Rikuyu is quite unlike any other in the game, though as its item description says, it does originate from the same country as the Far Eastern inspired Canehurst Chikage. In fact, one weapon which does look strikingly similar to the untransformed version of the Rikuyu is Eleonora's pole blade from Elden Ring, with Eleonora in that game hailing from the Far Eastern inspired Land of Reeds, same with Bloody Finger Hunter Yura. Speaking of blood, that's a main difference between the Rikuyu and the Chikage, because whereas the latter weapon relies on blood tinge power in its transformed state, gradually eating away at the player's health while active, the Rikuyu does not. It is a pure skill weapon with tremendous skill scaling. Mind you, this isn't the case when Maria herself uses it in the boss fight, because hers absolutely draws upon the power of blood, as seen in her bloody transition into phase 2, where she impales herself with both blades, greatly increasing her damage output and range from this point on, before her power intensifies even further in the phase 3 transition as her blood ignites in scarlet whirls and torrents of flame. Sadly, there are none of these fancy hematological pyrotechnics when little old you or me uses the Rikuyu, but who cares, because it's a sick-ass weapon nonetheless, boasting an expansive, varied and complex moveset, being able to transform back and forth from its larger one-handed form to a twin-bladed form, kinda like Eileen's Blades of Mercy, except with longer blades. With a Rikuyu, you've got thrusts, sweeps, swipes and spins galore for any situation, making it an ideal weapon for the more technical player who is more interested in dexterous manoeuvring, as opposed to the more overt bludgeoning offered by other larger weapons with bigger blades and heftier hammers. For as excellent a weapon as the Rikuyu is though, one of the most notorious aspects of it is how you get it in the first place. This one isn't like the Holy Moonlight Sword where it drops after the boss is defeated, or the Burial Blade which you can buy after getting the Old Hunter badge dropped by Gehrman, but rather, you find the fucking thing down the well, tying into Maria's backstory. That being that after the atrocities carried out upon the inhabitants of the fishing hamlet by Bergenworth, of which both she and Gehrman were present for, she threw the Rikuyu down the hamlet well. Such was the intensity of her guilt and self-disgust, and indeed, in order to get it for yourself, you need to do battle with a pair of shark giants. You know, the most terrifying enemies in the game. It's a brutal battle against two profoundly fishy foes, but in my view it is entirely worth it to get your hunter's hands on this wicked weapon. For Elden Ring, FromSoft went right back to the old boss soul weapon transposition system, though instead of harvesting powerful souls, you're out collecting remembrances, which work exactly the same way as boss souls, for you to either pop for a bounty of runes or take back to finger reader Enya at the round table hold to allow for the creation of weapons, and lots of other stuff too. Feels highly redundant for me to say this yet again, but I'm gonna. It was very tough for me to choose a favourite here, because there's just so much sick shit. So many big awesome weapons from all these big awesome bosses, with all their compelling personalities and backstories. But for me, there is one particular weapon that I consider to be king among them all. And appropriately, it's the weapon belonging to the Omen King himself. It's Morgoth's cursed sword. Yes, you've got the hefty Star Scourge greatswords with their gravitational grandeur, and yeah, you've got the blasphemous blade, a living sword of terrible implication, but no other weapon left me feeling as dazzled and awestruck as Morgoth's cursed sword upon first being revealed in Leyndell. Of course, we technically contend with this weapon way back in Limgrave, at the entrance to Stormvale Castle where Margit, the fell omen, waits in ambush. Except this isn't the true Morgoth, it's just a sort of spirit ash version of him, just like how we fight a projection of Rennala in phase 2 of her fight, though his weapon's true form remains wholly concealed beneath a casing of stone, making it look like some sort of wicked cane. When we encounter the Omen King's true self in Leyndell though by the foot of the Erd Tree, he, in a sense, unsheathes his weapon, cracking the casing to reveal its enigmatic form, a warped but stunning blade of shifting hues, ending in a wicked point. Insanely cool weapon reveal, and you betcha that I couldn't wait to get my own hands on it after seeing this cutscene. Morgoth's cursed greatsword has some fairly steep stat requirements, needing a reasonable 14 in strength, a pretty hefty 35 points in dexterity, and an additional 17 points in arcane, with this being one of the game's few naturally dex arcane weapons. The two other examples that spring to mind are Rivers of Blood and Eleonora's Pole Blade, and just like those weapons, Morgoth's cursed greatsword causes bleed build-up, rather decent bleed build-up too. Being a special armament, there's no capacity to infuse it with any other fancy Ashes of War, but thankfully its own unique Ash of War happens to be the Cursed Blood Slice, mimicking the very move that Morgoth himself does in the fight with him, allowing you to ignite the cursed blood locked away inside the blade for more damage and bleed build-up. It's actually pretty similar to how Morgoth's brother, Mohg, uses burning blood against you in the fight with him, though in that case, the source of the blood is that of the Formless Mother, whereas Morgoth draws upon the power of his own cursed omen blood. It's an absolute banger of a curved greatsword with a sick moveset and a savage Ash of War, and hey, the bleed potential ain't half bad either. But honestly, even disregarding all of its offensive capabilities, it just looks really fucking cool. In fact, I think Morgoth's cursed sword is the single sickest weapon in this entire list. My honourable mention goes to a boss weapon I've never really heard all that much fuss about, but which I think looks just about as glorious as the boss it's made from. It's the Dragon King's Crag Blade. Unlike most of the weapons on this list, no entity directly uses the Crag Blade against you, with it instead symbolising the awesome power of Dragon Lord Placidusax, who uses golden flames, ancient lightning, teeth and claws to deal damage, as opposed to him wielding any sort of conventional weapon. Mind you, not sure it'd be fair to call the Dragon King's Crag Blade any sort of conventional weapon. To be honest, its name is a bit of a misnomer because it doesn't really feature much of a blade. Rather, this is a heavy thrusting sword, one of only 4 in the game, with the other 3 being the Great EP, Godskin Stitcher and the Bloody Hellas. As such, it features no slashing attacks to speak of, revolving entirely around weighty thrusts with its point. Even though Placidusax himself doesn't use this weapon, its form and essence is heavily derived from the Dragon Lord's appearance, featuring the same white gold coloration of his scales, and furthermore, it deals additional lightning damage on attack, red lightning to be specific, the lightning of the ancient dragons, of which Placidusax is king. As such, this weapon actually deals bonus damage against dragon-type enemies, though in addition to its thrusting capabilities, I think its Ash of War is one of the coolest in the game. In Placidusax's second phase, he will dematerialise into the air, into a dark cloud of crimson lightning, ascending and then descending for a sequence of storm assaults from the sky, and indeed, the thundercloud form Ash of War lets you do much the same. You can even extend the distance and duration of cloud travel by holding down the button, which I just think is so awesome. I am on record as being a massive fan of Placidusax as a boss. In fact, he's in my personal Soulsborne top 10, and so any weapon which lets me pretend, just for a moment, that I too am a cloud. Well folks, that's the kind of weapon that well deserves a place on this video of sickest Soulsborne weapons. And there you have it folks, there is my list. I've been wanting to do a video on boss weapons for quite a while, because boss weapons really are the coolest category of weapons in these games, but I really didn't know how to approach the topic, because I'm not a PvP guy at all and I don't give a fuck about comparing numbers and presenting comprehensive breakdowns of movesets, which is why I instead opted to name my personal picks for sickest weapons, which is a more nebulous term but which I think certainly applies to many of these badass blades, axes and hammers. I had actually originally planned to also include what I consider to be the lamest boss weapons from each game too, but there really weren't enough that I genuinely think are lame, and so I just focused on the coolest ones. I'd like to do more videos on other weapon types in the future, but like I said, don't expect anything too technical and objective, because that just ain't my style. Please allow me to give another massive thanks to my fabulous patrons over on Patreon. And on that note, cheers for watching and cheerio.